I would like to welcome to the stage Mick Kelly.
Good evening. It's lovely to see you all, and thank you very much to Tom for the introduction. What I want to do is just speak to some of the things that Tom has mentioned, particularly around this idea of food empathy, and tee that up a little bit and speak to why we believe that growing your own food can fix the future. Like Jeremy, and maybe we should give a big round of applause for Jeremy actually in his beautiful talk. I started growing my own food about 2 decades ago, and I'm still completely obsessed with it, absolutely bitten by the bug as soon as I started growing my own food because of that garlic moment in a supermarket that Tom mentioned. But I genuinely do believe that growing some of your own food can fix the future, and I'm going to hopefully lay out a little bit of why I think that is. A lot of people in this room, we've an extraordinarily diverse kind of an audience tonight of, business people and academia and students and people just generally interested in climate and the food system. So I think a lot of people here would be very familiar with some of the problems, but I just want to sort of bring it up to 50,000 feet for a second and think about the food system particularly. So if you think about the big picture problem of greenhouse gas emissions, the food system's responsible for around 1/3 of those. So a huge contributor to the overall problem of greenhouse gas emissions. And then when you think about the other sort of, the other sort of tandem problems to greenhouse gas emissions, so things like biodiversity collapse, the species extinction, the deforestation that's happening, the water usage, and so on, our food system is responsible for 70-80% of those problems. So a hugely extractive system that's causing huge problems on our planet. And that would be one thing if it was doing a really good job of keeping us all well and fed, but unfortunately it's not. So at the moment we've around 8 billion people on the planet. At one end of the scale, we've got about 2 billion people who are either malnourished or don't have enough food to eat. At the other end of the scale, we've got 2 billion people who are overweight or obese. And then it used to be it was infectious diseases that killed us most reliably, and now it's diet-related disease. And particularly the sort of what are called the 4 horsemen diseases, diet-related diseases, things like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. And I believe actually that huge part of the problem, the reason this is all such a huge problem, is that we've become so utterly disconnected from our food. And as a result, I think we've become disenfranchised, we've lost our sovereignty around food. Just the basics of knowing where it comes from and how it's produced have been almost entirely lost to us. And of course, it is also true to say there's an entire sort of cohort of people who are completely disinterested in where their food comes from as well. So that brings us to this idea of food empathy, which is something I think that I experienced myself when I grew my own food, and certainly comes true in Jeremy's writing as well, which is that on top of the sort of immediate, the benefits that you would sort of associate with food growing, so the physical health benefits, the mental health benefits, saving carbon, saving money, and just, absolutely loving growing my own food. What I started to notice was over time, my overall behaviors around food started to change. And we've done a lot of research in GIY over the years, trying to get to the bottom of why this happens and what happens. And we found a really, really consistent array of behavior changes that people who grow their own food, even if it's only at a very small amount, a small scale. And it's those food empathy behaviors that I want to speak a little bit more about now. So the first one, I guess, as a grower, and you'll hear from Paul Brophy in a couple of minutes as well about the importance of soil to our growing. And I think as an amateur food grower, you really start to figure out that food growing is not about the seeds and it's not about the plants, it's actually all about the soil. And you start to appreciate the connection between the health of your soil and the health of the food that you're eating, but also your own health ultimately. In the Food Matters series, we interviewed a farmer called Colin Flynn from Kildare, and he spoke about his light bulb moment, which is where he was driving his tractor, he was ploughing a field, he's a tillage farmer, and he noticed that there were no birds following the plough. And of course, the reason there was no birds was that there was no worms left in the soil for them to eat. And the plough or the birds following the plough is the quintessential sort of countryside image. But what he found when he tested his soil was that his soil was biologically dead. The thing that really struck me about Colin was he was honest about the fact that he could still churn out food from that soil using chemical interventions, but the soil itself was completely dead. So that got me thinking, I think, about my own soil at home in the garden and thinking about soil as a potential solution to those twin problems that I spoke about, the climate problem and the health problem. Because, of course, soil itself can be an extraordinarily effective as trees at saving carbon and acting as a carbon sink. But what about the idea that it can also be part of the solution to this health problem? So we talk a lot about how particular vegetables, say carrots as an example, are really good for us because they've got X vitamin and Y mineral, and they do X, Y, Z for our health. But we never talk about what would happen what's the difference in the nutrition, the nutrient density of a carrot that's grown in soil A, which is sort of Colin Flynn's biologically dead soil as it was back then, and carrot B that's grown in soil that's living soil, organic, regenerative, and so on. Dan Barber talks about this idea of the carroty carrot. He used to grow carrots for his restaurant in a farm in upstate New York. And these carrots tasted completely different to the ones that he was getting for his restaurant from the commercial food system, even the organic ones that he would buy. And I think it's fair to say that sort of the flavor and the deliciousness is also points to, I think, the nutrient density in those. As a grower, you become a farmer on a small scale, but you become a shepherd of the soil, and you get to really start to appreciate its importance. As a grower, we also, I think a lot about food pollution and the when I speak about food pollution, the episode we did on this, we covered obviously the chemicals that go into producing the food that we eat. And we have a particularly acute problem with this in Ireland. So about 2% of the food that is produced in this country is organic, which means 98% of it isn't. And we lag behind other European countries to a pretty alarming degree. In Austria, it's up to nearly 30% and so on. So it's a huge issue for us. And the reality of that is that it means that the food often that we're eating has been sprayed dozens of times in a single season, often very, very recently before it's been harvested and eaten. So that's a huge problem. And then obviously the second sort of source of real food pollution is the plastic that goes into our packaging to get the food from farm to table. And Jess is going to be talking about that a lot later on. And obviously, I think we all have a sense when we look even into our recycling bins at the moment, when you come home from the supermarket, the amount of plastic that we have now compared to what it was 10 years ago is just extraordinary. We're swimming in a sea of plastic, millions of tons of it being produced just to wrap our food and get it home from the supermarket. It's typically single use. And in almost, in only around 50% of cases is it recycled. So another huge problem for us. Again, as food growers, you get to avoid both of those issues because very few food growers are going to go around with a knapsack of chemicals in their garden and spray all the food they're growing. And then obviously there's no packaging associated with it either. The gentleman in this picture walking off, I think I'm wearing the same shirt in that picture, which is slightly alarming. There's a guy called Cathal Lenihan, who was the biggest, Paul would know him very well, one of the biggest cabbage growers in the state. And we filmed with him very shortly after he closed his business down because he could not make money from growing. The biggest cabbage grower in the state could not make money from growing cabbages. That's, I suppose, systematic or symptomatic of a much, much bigger problem, which is that just at the turn of the millennium, so around 20 years ago, we had around 400 to 500 commercial veg growers in this country. We now have less than 60, and we're losing them, all of the time. And the reason that we're losing them, of course, is a sort of a double-edged sword, where we've got input costs going through the roof because the price of fertilizer, the price of labor, and so on has absolutely exploded. And then, of course, if you look at a graph of the cost of vegetables in retail over the last 10 years, it's going like that. So the 49-cent price promotions that started as a sort of a one-off thing at Christmas about 10 years ago have become a permanent feature of the landscape. And so we've permanently lowered the value of veg into something that is causing absolute carnage for that sector. We are watching in real time, and almost nobody is talking about it, what happens when we don't support our local food producers. Our veg sector is absolutely dying, and probably it won't get spoken about until there's no Irish veg left on the shelves in our supermarkets. And that's a really, really serious issue for our food security, but also if we have to import our veg from places like Spain and Holland, they also have their own issues with around the climate emergency, weather-related events associated with that as well. So that's a really, really serious issue. What we found in our research is that food growers, when they go to buy stuff, and they often have to, obviously, if they're not able to grow all the food that they eat, they tend to look for the next best thing, which is a locally produced alternative. So that's a really important issue. And then, of course, there's the issue of food waste, which is, such a massive, massive problem. The statistic that always catches me, I think, is that around 10%, depending on the report that you read, of the entire greenhouse gas emissions, not just for food, but the full amount of them, 10% of those emissions are created producing food that never gets eaten. So that gives you a sense of the scale of how big an issue this is. And obviously it's a massively challenging issue from a climate perspective, but it's also a moral outrage at a time when 800 million people around the world will go to bed hungry tonight. So the food waste issue is a hugely difficult problem. I think, again, as a food grower, when you go to the trouble of growing something yourself, you spend whatever it is, 6 weeks or 6 months growing something, you're much less likely to waste any of that food as a result. And I'm currently obsessed with all the parts of the plants that you can't eat or that we don't normally eat, so the carrot tops and the broccoli stems and so on, because you don't want to waste any of the food that you've gone to the trouble of growing. We also get to eat more plants as food growers because, again, there's around 50,000 edible plant species on the planet at the moment. Human beings, generally speaking, will eat around 1% of those. So there's a huge diversity of plants out there waiting for us to explore. 75% of all of the food that gets eaten around the world comes from just 12 plant species and 5 animal species out of those 50,000. And that's obviously a huge problem from a biodiversity perspective. It's a huge problem from a food security perspective, but it's also just so boring. Like, there's these incredible foods out there waiting for us to discover, and as food growers, we get to do that. I'm very, very careful to say I'm not a food growing expert, right? I've been doing it for around 20 years, and I absolutely love it. I grow around 50 different types of vegetables in my garden every year. And I've still got lots to learn, but even with that limited knowledge I have, I still am able to do all of that. And I particularly, I love the fact that there's that diversity waiting for me at the end of the garden, but also to be able to grow things that are relatively hard to find in the supermarket. So things like, celeriac and fennel, and the more unusual things like yacon and oca and all these wonderful vegetables that you get to try as a food grower. And we're not an anti-meat organization, but we do think we need to get way more plant forward in our diets as a whole. And then the final one is about the final sort of food empathy behavior is following the seasons. Because again, one of the things that's happened over particularly the last 2 or 3 decades, is that we've sort of fallen into this kind of mono diet, where we sort of have this diet that's presumed to be the healthiest or whatever, and that's what we eat all through the year. And of course, our supermarket will help us do that, because the supermarket, generally speaking, is a place where there are no seasons. There's this, there's an incredible array of vegetables available in your supermarket all year round, and that's a marvel of the modern food system. But what it means is we don't get to eat like this anymore. And as a food grower, one of the great joys for me is plugging back into this type of eating, which is kind of, broadly speaking, follows what you see on the screen here. So at the moment, we're sort of somewhere between the first picture and the second picture. Plants are still producing their leaves, and we're eating loads of leafy greens because that's what our system needs at this time of the year after a long winter. And then we'll move in, the plants start to fruit, we need hydration. The plants are producing fruit for us to eat, tomatoes, cucumbers, courgettes, all vegetables fantastic to hydrate us. Then we move into the autumn. The berry fruits are starting to appear on the hedgerows around the country, full of vitamin C and also full of sugar, like traditionally, obviously, to get us through the winter, although less and less we need that. And then finally, into the winter itself, and we go under the ground to eat. We're eating the root crops, the starchy crops that warm us and keep us fed and nourished during the winter months. So there's a tremendous wisdom in seasonal eating. I think nature knows what we should be eating at different times of the year that we get to plug back into as growers. And it's such a wonderful arc of a journey. If you eat tomatoes all year round, you don't appreciate the first tomatoes of the season. So that's an incredible way to eat, I think, that has brought me so much joy myself at home. So I'm going to finish on this point, which is, I suppose, just to try and paint a little bit of a picture of what we're hoping to achieve tonight. I spoke a bit about soil and obviously the plants themselves, but I do want to mention seeds, because seeds, I feel like, have been my great teacher in the garden. So they're an incredible thing. Like we've set up just outside the door there a seed sowing place. I'm going to speak about that in a minute. But when you look at these seeds and you think about the fact that a courgette seed knows how to become a plant that will produce about 30 or 40 other courgettes in a season, has everything it needs right in that little tiny thing. So seeds have taught me a lot. They've taught me optimism. It's a sort of an act of profound hope to stick a seed into soil, with such limited knowledge in my case, and to sort of trust that that's going to turn into food over time, particularly when you're doing that in the cold spring when it doesn't feel very likely it's going to work at all. It's also taught me not to sweat the small stuff. Like my growing year every year starts as this as well, Paul. It starts as a perfect plan in my head. It's a perfectly worked out thing, and everything's going to work out perfectly, and then it goes to shit during the year. And that's fine. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes things happen that I don't understand, and that's all fine too. But finally, I think really importantly, it's taught me collaboration, because for all of the amazing, the wonder of a little seed, in this particular case, it needs me. It needs me to take it out of the packet and stick it in the soil, and it needs me to provide the conditions for it to thrive in the ground. And so I get to be the hero in a nature story. And let's be honest, that's not happening very much at the moment for us as a species. So they teach us, collaboration and optimism, and we get to be part of something wonderful like that. So what we are asking Tom and I think, for tonight is we want everybody in this room to grow something going away from here. So could I get a show of hands how many people actually have grown something before? Anything at all? Wow. That's amazing. At least well over half. What have the other half of you been doing with your time? I don't understand it. So what we're asking you to do is, for the half of you in the room that have grown something before, please recommit to doing more of it and telling more people about it. And for the half of you that have never done it before, You guys are our target demographic. We've got seeds and soil and everything waiting for you at the back. They're in little compostable cups with lids. You take them away, or take 2 away and give 1 to a friend. We would be delighted for that to happen. And we don't need you to be 100%, grow 100% your food, or even close to it. If you can grow even 1% of the food that you eat, it can change the other 99% through these food empathy behaviors that I'm talking about. Get reconnected with your food, claim your sovereignty back around food, and start growing something yourself. And imagine what it feels like. Look at that smug face. That's what it feels like to grow 2 bunches of carrots. And I can highly recommend it. Imagine what it would feel like to do that for yourself or your family and put that on the table. The carroty carrot is what we're after. But also imagine what it would be like if all, 250 people in the room, I think, something like that, if all 250 of you left here, grew some of your own food and developed those food empathy behaviors. And going back to my original side, our goal in GIY is to get 100 million people around the world to grow some of their own food by 2030. Imagine what it would be like if we could create an army of 100 million smug people like this, growing their own food and developing food empathy, and the change that would bring to our food system. So I'm going to finish on that point. Thanks a million for listening, and I'm going to introduce our panel now.